Welcome to the Microschools show, your window on the global microschools movement. Whether you're a teacher with a dream to build a school of your own or a parent looking for a school that will suit your amazing kid, you're sure to be inspired by the creativity and innovation of our guests. Greetings, I'm your host, Dr. Mara Leineberger, and in the coming episodes, I'm going to feature guests from all over the globe who have championed personalized learning for students by building a microschool of their own, as well as some of the key players in the microschools movement. Today is our inaugural episode, and I've chosen to feature Steve Hargadon, founder of the Learning Revolution, whose website and conference are providing the platform for the show's launch. For those of you who don't know Steve's work yet, Steve is the founder and the director of the Learning Revolution Project, the host of the Future of Education interview series, and founder and chair of a number of annual worldwide events, including the Global Education Conference and the Library 2.0 series of mini conferences, as well as the brand new Emergency Home Learning Summit, which launched on October 1st, 2020. Steve's work has been around the democratization of learning. He pioneered the use of live, virtual, and peer-to-peer education conferences. He popularized the idea of unconferences for educators and built one of the first modern social networks for teachers in 2007 called Classroom 2.0. Steve is the author of several books, including Educational Networking, The Important Role Web 2.0 Will Play in Education, and Modern Learning, Rediscovering the Transformative Promise of Educational Technology, as well as the new text, How to Win at the Game of School, a survival guide for students, parents, and teachers. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thanks, Mara. Glad to be here.
You're welcome. Hey, Steve, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your mission, and maybe a little bit about why microschools are of interest to you?
Yeah, I can tell you a lot. First, I want to say that those articles you referenced are actually articles and not books.
Oh, okay.
Don't want anybody to go searching Amazon expecting to find them. But I think I have a fairly unique perspective on teaching and learning, in part because of the background with my own children and the kind of independent decisions that we made regarding their education, and then getting involved in Web 2.0 and the ability for people to talk to each other through the web, and the nature of the changes that we've seen and the role that I've been part of in kind of facilitating that in the education world. So is that a good starting place?
I think so. For those who maybe aren't quite as familiar with the notion of Web 2.0, can you just give a little snippet of that, a little synopsis?
Yeah, it's actually really worth knowing. So Tim O'Reilly and his team coined that phrase when they were trying to discover why companies had survived the dot-com bust. Certain tech companies had survived and others had not. And the conclusion they came to was, and it seems so obvious in retrospect, but at the time it was new. The conclusion was that they were companies that had created a hosted platform for user content rather than companies who were providing their own content. So think of the difference between Encyclopedia Britannica and Wikipedia. So the idea was that these Web 2.0 companies had created a space for users to interact with each other and to create content, and that was something new. And it was, and it's this sort of 2.0 world. We're now so familiar with it because of Twitter and Facebook and other really easy platforms that allow us to connect with each other. But you think about it, Twitter doesn't produce news or content for us each day. We produce it for each other, and Twitter's the mechanism for that. So that was Web 2.0. So I had interviewed Gina Bianchini and Mark Andreessen early on when they had started a new company called Ning. And Mark's considered sort of the creator of the web browser, Mosaic, when he was, I guess, a graduate student. And so Mark and Gina had started this company called Ning, and it was a build-your-own social networking platform. And so I created something called School 2.0 within Ning. And that didn't actually take off. For some reason, it didn't ring anybody's bell. But when I created Classroom 2.0, all of a sudden teachers started flocking to it, and they were sharing with each other. Now, flocking is a funny word, right? Because at the time, we had 400 people who signed up and were communicating with each other, and we thought that was unbelievable. Right? It had just we'd never seen it before. Prior to that, there had been educational bloggers who had sort of followers, but you had to sort of figure out how to follow a blog, and it was a technical aspect. But Classroom 2.0 kind of opened the door to teachers connecting with other teachers. It wasn't an uncontroversial moment. There were a lot of people who felt that the introduction of social networking into education was actually really a bad idea. They were concerned, it was MySpace era, they were concerned about suicide rates of kids in South Korea, and they felt like there was this danger of shallowness and lack of control, right? That somebody could post something that would show up on your page and you weren't actually in control of it. Do you remember that? You'd have a page and someone could post a comment and you weren't actually in control of that comment, and people were really afraid of that. But somehow I saw this capacity within the social networking platform to allow teachers to connect with each other as colleagues, between different buildings. And this was fascinating to me. It was like a crystal clear to me that this was going to radically shift how educators saw their own professional development and their capacity to connect with each other and to learn from each other. So Classroom 2.0, School 2.0, which didn't succeed, and then Classroom 2.0, which did, were both modeled after something called Library 2.0. A guy named Bill Drew had created a Library 2.0 network. Now, it turns out a couple of years later, Bill said, I don't want to do this anymore. And I said, I'll run it for you. I'm glad to keep it going. I'm a big fan of libraries. And Library 2.0 on its own has grown to over 44,000 members since I took it over. And we run a series of events for librarians. But anyway, the core concept of Web 2.0 is really behind a lot of what we're seeing. And if we put this in the context of the history of the world, we're seeing something that has just never happened before. This ability not just to connect with each other and to share ideas, but to do so globally. Like I talk about this moment educationally, right? We're having this conversation about teaching and learning that, I don't think has ever really occurred before. That doesn't occur perfectly, right? People are at all different places. Someone's starting a pandemic pod, someone's starting a microschool, someone's homeschooling, someone's learning at home because their school's shut down. But you think about it, this is a moment where we're talking about something so profoundly important that previously was institutionalized. Mm-hmm. So, the public school system for most countries, and it's a pervasive system around the world, is an institutional system. And social networking and communicating with each other directly are not institutionalized processes. Yeah. So there's this incredible moment to say, what are we really doing? People have for decades said, why do we do this to kids in schools? But they have fewer rights than prisoners have in a prison. It's not really about learning most of the time. It's about obeying. And that conversation has gone on, but it's gone on in very small pockets. So to all of a sudden have people be able to jump a little bit into the pool and say, oh, well, yeah, how come I don't like this homework system, and why is it done this way, and why is my kid sitting in front of a computer screen for 7 hours, and how does that actually match their ability to learn, and what does learning have to do with career? Right? I mean, these are profoundly important questions, because the homeschoolers for years have said we can show higher test scores than traditional public schoolers. We feel like our kids are learning more, but why is it so hard to show success? Well, in large part because success has been measured through this institutionalized structure, and you say, okay, is that actually what we want to do? Yeah. Is that how we measure success?
Funny, because when you talked about Web 2.0 and you talked about starting out with School 2.0 and then Classroom 2.0, you really got me thinking about what preceded the microschools movement was the alternative education movement, and it was something that a few people knew about, and there were plenty of examples of fine small schools, which is what microschools are. But like our Waldorf schools and our Montessori schools and our democratic schools, the Liberated Learners Network. All of these people who've been doing alternative education were using this term that didn't, for whatever reason, like it's not right or wrong, the fact that people didn't buy into School 2.0. It's not right or wrong, but it's almost like the marketing of Classroom 2.0 was the thing that captured people's imagination. And the term microschool has done the same thing. I came across it like 5 years ago, and when I saw it, in my mind, it absolutely captured the idea that was in my head, which was, school had gotten too big, it had gotten too formal, it had become too structured, too standardized, and in so many ways we'd lost touch with the student, and allowing the student to co-create and to self-direct and all those things you were talking about that you have been doing with teachers, with these NINGs, with these social networking groups, are things that are in microschools that are allowing kids to co-create, to self-direct, and to really just generally have a lot more fun. So I think in some weird way, it's like this parallel. The microschools movement is sort of taking off in a way that your classroom 2.0 did, or that your library
Yeah.
2.0 did.
Well, one way you and I could talk about this is something we've discussed before, right? So I have this marketer I like and follow, Jeff Walker, who says, sell them what they want, give them what they need. Mm-hmm. Right. So when I started School 2.0, the idea was, well, there was this movement that people had talked about School 2.0, like the new school and the new school model, and how electronics and ed tech would play into it. That's a really interesting conversation, but it's not what people really wanted, right? They wanted, I'm in class and I'm dealing with something and I have to figure it out, and I want to talk to somebody else to try and find out how to do it. These big philosophical questions, in some ways we're going through the same thing right now, right? There's this moment where people are saying, I have an immediate need. My child is at home staring at a screen for 7 hours. You may want to talk to me about the history of alternative education and John Holt and John Taylor Gatto and Ivan Illich and pedagogy and philosophy. And most people are going to say, that's not actually what I want. I need to know.
People need
I need to know what to do now.
They need their kid learning. They need their kid engaged so that they can either go to work or they can work remotely at home. The pain point of families right now really is, first and foremost, is my child going to be safe and cared for? Is my child going to be learning and enjoying that learning? Is my child going to have connection with their peers? So social interaction. And actually, probably I should have put that ahead of the learning part, because I think at the end of the day, we as educators, education, learning is the most important thing to us. But a parent's first, think about your own children, Steve. What's the first and foremost, what's the most important thing to you? That they're safe?
I'm not normal. Yeah, of course. But I think your point is really well taken, right? Which is, most parents are like, well, I need my kid to get into a good college because I need them to have a good background, and I need them to get a good job, and I need them to have stability. And so that's the priority. And I don't think any of us want to criticize that intentionally, but it's a limited view, right? The whole concept of a liberal arts college, this concept of learning how to learn and to be the kind of person who can make good decisions and can be thoughtful, those sort of core values aren't necessarily the things that drive the marketplace of education, and certainly sometimes don't drive the school experience. Like my whole Game of School project revolves around this concept that if I talk to the students who are ranked at the top of their classes in schools, they will say, we're not good learners, we're good at the game. We know which teachers like what homework, we know how to get the test done. We're becoming great, we're becoming really good at this game, and the game will continue because it's going to go to college and the workplace. And it's this game of how large institutions get things done.
Yeah,
and a lot of us.
I'm not sure that people in the workplace, just knowing how to play the game at your job isn't necessarily going to be fulfilling, and it's not necessarily going to make your employer happy. I mean, increasingly, I'm seeing the requests for, employees who can think, who can solve ill-structured problems, who can work in a team, who have resiliency, who have a whole set of skills that aren't necessarily mastered when all you're really doing is trying to play the game well.
I'm not going to argue that point but I still think that the preeminent selection criteria for people coming into large organizations, especially banking, insurance, healthcare, is, can you do what we ask you to do, and can you do it on time, and can you do it well? And
And in
I
those cases,
don't really need you to be, yeah.
I was going to say that requires specialized training. I mean, I have a son-in-law who went back to a coding boot camp, and in 16 weeks, got all of the skills he needed to land a job with one of the big banking firms here in my hometown at a salary that he was not capable of getting otherwise. And so, he didn't have to go to college for that. 18 weeks, boom, in, done. And the price tag was much, much lower. And I'm just going to come out and say to everybody who's watching, like, I am not saying don't go to college. What I want to see kids doing is really getting a chance to explore ideas, try things out, and have a chance to think about what they would like to do, instead of putting so much focus on playing the game. Because then when they, if they choose to go to college, they can potentially be in a very focused track that's preparing them for the work they want to do. I mean, if you're going to become an engineer, you have to study science and math. If you're going to become a astrophysicist, you're going to have to be studying science and math. If you want to become a professional concert violinist, you are going to have to be studying music theory and practicing. And so, your preparation is going to be entirely different. You may or may not need college to do that.
Yeah, and we've recently had the news that Google was offering some online courses that if you took them and completed them at a certain level, they would consider that the equivalent of a college degree for like $400.
Yeah.
And like, okay, I mean, there's a, sort of my core understanding of how life works is that we're narrative driven, right? That we tell stories, and that we have stories about the institutions in our lives, right? And so we have the story, right? We have a story about our country. We have a story about the company that we work for, or the industry that we're in, right? So the stories are good stories because they match our aspirations, and they're easy to tell, but they aren't always necessarily what's actually going on.
Yeah.
Right. So you'd say, okay, so what's the story of schools been? Well, the story of schools has been that they help every child reach their potential. Now, there's some secondary stories, right? It helps to people to become good citizens, and it gives a standard level of capability for everybody. But I'll often say to someone, what percentage of high school students do you think graduate as competent adults? Could live on their own, could have a job and provide for a family? And most people will kind of laugh, and they'll do this sort of recognition laugh, and they'll say, oh, 5%. And I think that sort of reveals to us that the story that we tell about what schools accomplish is different than what actually happens in schools. Right?
Yeah. Well, that would be a whole nother focus for us about what really is the purpose of school, and if it's not doing the thing that we think it should be doing, then what could we do differently? And what this show is really about is bringing to light people who have thought through those kind of things. So we certainly you're welcome to come back and we can talk about that. That's something people really want to dig into. But we're also going to bring on people who have decided that maybe that's not the best way to prepare a kid, that maybe there needs to be more of that, things like financial literacy, learning about budgeting a home, and all of those kind of things that involve your adult life as well. And who have gone out and have built a small school in their community. Now, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and I should just anchor this one more time and say today is Friday, October the 2nd, 2020, because people could be watching this later. We're still in the middle of this coronavirus pandemic. So what people are doing, a lot of schools are not open in person, or they're doing some kind of a hybrid schedule where kids are doing some of their learning remotely online and going in a couple days a week. Families are really struggling to balance work life, home life, and their children's school life. So many parents have chosen to get together and co-support kids' distance learning, and that's a term that has been named pandemic pods. What I can tell you is many people who've started to do that work are finding that it's actually working better. that their kids are happy, that sharing the effort of the child's education is convenient, that it's safer, in this time when there's this virus that is being transmitted. And it's allowing families to have lower exposure. So I think, Steve, as people go for extended periods of time working in these pods, their brains are going to begin to think, well, this is pretty decent. What if we wanted to do this on a more permanent basis? That's when the term microschool comes in. Because, really, in order to be able to do something long term, you need to have a plan. And, there needs to be a little bit more structure, and there needs to be a look at state statutes as far as how you set up as a school, et cetera. I'm curious, what do you think the role of microschools should be in this current educational climate?
So I'm going to go right back to the narrative piece, because I know it felt like a tangent, but I think that what that narrative piece gives us is an understanding that large-scale narratives don't really change. And so there are going to be people who will carve out alternatives. So the alternative education movement has been a relatively small movement. The homeschooling movement, maybe a little bit larger, but not super large. But there are people who've sort of carved out and said, no, I actually really care about this part of my child's life, it's learning, and I want it to look a certain way. And in the same way that I might like Chinese food or Thai food, and we'll start a restaurant around that theme. People who determine that there's a certain way that they like to have schooling take place for their kids, or education take place, can kind of carve that out. And I think that's what's happening, right? And I think it starts with pandemic pods, and I think there's some percentage of families, we've got families who are in deep distress. There's no getting around that. But I also think there's the surveys have shown that there's some percentage of, not an inconsequential percentage of families who are saying, this is actually better for us. We're happier, right? And then they start thinking, okay, so what would I really like? And teachers who say, I haven't really enjoyed what I've been doing at school for a long time, and I'd like to create an environment that allows for creativity or the arts or the flourishing of these sorts of things. So I see the microschool movement as being an opportunity for people to take an alternative path, to say, okay, I'm not going to run a McDonald's or a Burger King. I want to run the homegrown Thai restaurant, and this is what I'd like to have, and I'm going to allow for people who have similar mindsets to come in and participate, and this is what we think the good learning experience will be for the child.
Yeah, I think I like your sort of parallel metaphor of the personal owned versus chain restaurant. I think of microschools in that way. I also think of them kind of like the yoga movement, where in the beginning, 30, 40 years ago, very few people even knew about yoga. It was only people who were in big cities like New York that had some yogi come over from India. But slowly over time, as more people tried yoga and were trained, yoga studios began to pop up in small, like medium-sized towns, and then suburbs, and then small towns. And I mean, we're to the point where I think if people haven't heard of yoga, they're probably the minority now. And I think that microschools, the alternative education movement was sort of if you've ever looked at that, I know you've seen this, and the viewers, you may want to look up, there's a chart, it's called the diffusion of innovation model, and it's kind of this bell curve. The early adopters are people in the alternative education movement. People have been building small schools. Pretty much people haven't stopped. I mean, one-room schoolhouses were the thing, and they still exist. And people have been building different kinds of schools for 100 years, maybe. And I think now we're starting to get to the point where everybody's had to be in a small school, being at home or in a pandemic pod. So like more people are aware of it. And I think more people are going to say, you know what? Yeah, we, just like you said, their story is going to say, this was actually better. We might like this better. Our kid might enjoy something that's more thematic. In the show, we'll go through so many of the hallmarks of what a microschool is. It's all of in a nutshell, it's all of the best practices that teachers are taught to utilize in their classrooms, except there's just more time and more ability to do those things because they're smaller, because they're more personal. So I'm curious, I've been hearing a lot of talk, Steve, about microschools, pandemic pods taking away from or actually defunding public education. We've also got the whole uh, charter schools movement and this push to give everybody vouchers to take the money wherever they want to. What do you think? Do you think microschools are going to hurt public schools?
I know this is a sensitive topic and it's hard for people. Again, my food analogy is a driver for me, right? Like if I go into a city that has a really rich food culture, I'm always curious, why is there such good food in this city, Portland or San Francisco? Why do I find so many good options in a city like this? And I think, what were the conditions that led to the flourishing of a diverse food culture? We would never send our kids to feeding stations 3 times a day to get exactly the same food, but we are comfortable sending our kids to schools to get exactly the same curriculum, or at least the promise of that. Mm-hmm. And so I really definitely fall into this category of believing that choice and opportunity are better drivers of innovation and success than centralized planning. Yeah. So I know I fall into that category. And so for me, and I've been in those meetings where people have said, the moment you open up to chartered schools, we're concerned about our jobs, and we're concerned that we won't get the funding that we need, and we need to be stable in order to provide equitable services for everybody, because if we don't have a stable base in public schooling, then we can't make sure that everybody's okay. And I get that. And I get those immediate concerns, and I get the larger concerns. At the same time, I do consider myself someone who sort of tends towards systemic thinking, right? So I love checks and balances, and I love the idea of a trial by jury to make sure that you understand that we're cognitively limited and we don't always know what's going on. So for me, I like the idea of creating an environment where there's more choice and opportunity, and that there is a cost to that, and we have to make sure that we have built in other safety nets and other ways of doing things. But I think the value and benefit of allowing independence is so important that it's worth doing. And then you figure out the other. And I, I'm trying to remember the quote and who said it, but it's hard to tuck a man out of an opinion his salary depends on. The truth is, we all are in immediate circumstances, and we have concerns, and we have bills to pay, and we have families to feed. And so someone who's in a teaching role who feels threatened by that kind of change, that's very real and tangible. I don't think in the long term it's helpful and useful, but I think it's real. And so I just feel like it's important to be sensitive to that, but at the same time, I can tell you 2 quick stories. So in 4th grade, our oldest daughter was in a California classroom where they had a big test coming up in 2 weeks that was sort of the test that would evaluate all the teachers in the school as well. And they're not supposed to prepare for the test. The test is supposed to be taken kind of blind. And we decided we were going to take a long weekend break, and the teacher called our child out in front of the classroom for being gone during the time she was going to prep the kids for the class, or for the test, which they're not supposed to do, but clearly they have a huge incentive to do because they're getting measured by it. And it was a terrible experience. I mean, it was not a good learning environment. It was a shaming experience. And on top of other things that had happened during that year, our daughter was pulling her hair out at night, right? It's like a terribly stressful thing. We just said, hey, we're going to pull her out of school. And we had some friends who were homeschoolers, and she got in with a homeschooling co-op, and she actually spent the rest of her school career through before college in developing a Shakespeare troupe and doing homeschool through a homeschooling group. And we didn't go looking for that, but it found us, and she kind of homeschooled herself. She was very driven and loved literature and Shakespeare.
So it was more unschooled, yeah?
Yeah, well, it was, we were unschoolers, but she was definitely very structured schooling because she had decided what she wanted and she chose it and worked on it. Then we had another situation where we had 4 kids. Our son really struggled in school, and we took him to a specialist who worked with kids with learning difficulties, and got through an assessment and a program, and got we were being given the final report, and the woman said, Mr. Hargadon, your son has difficulties in the following areas. He doesn't make images when he reads, and he et cetera, et cetera. And I said, okay, so kids who have these difficulties, what do they excel at? Like, what, how can I help him feel successful? What are the things he can work on? And she looked at me and she said, in my memory, I hope this is close to true. She said, "Oh no, you don't understand. These are deficiencies. There are no positives." And I literally, within minutes, was up and walking out of the room. I was like, my child is not defective.
Just wired.
Although that's
like just wired.
But that's the message a lot of kids get, and it's the message that a lot of adults get. That you're not good at school. You're not smart in math. In some ways, I like to say, not facetiously, that the thing schools do best is to teach most kids that they're not good learners. It categorizes them as being not good learners. So for me, this concept of somebody says, I have this really good way of thinking about schooling, and it's Montessori based, or it's some other, I have this sense of what a good educational experience would be, and I'm going to create a little minis, I'm going to create a microschool environment that matches that set of beliefs to really make a difference for a child. I'm like, yes, I'm all for it. And I know that breaks some people's sense of what the value of a public school system is, that's uniformly supported. But I actually believe that it needs to be more like the food system. There needs to be choice, and people who can start small restaurants and people who can run chain restaurants.
Well, the thing is, I know had there been 3 or 4 choices out there, you could have taken your son and let him visit different types of schools, and you might have potentially found something that actually played to his deficit, that actually saw that as a strength and worked to it. We're going to wrap up because we're just at about half an hour, and I want to keep this show short enough that it's able, people can digest it easily. I'm curious, and I'm going to ask this of everybody. Can you name for me 3 small schools that you know of that either, sort of dually, people should go take a look at if they happen to be in that area, and or that we should interview on the Microschools show? Who would be your top 3 small schools that you know of that people should know about?
Okay, so I'm unprepared for the question.
Okay.
And my kids are all older.
Okay.
Right. So we're now everybody out of school except one who's still in college. But I can tell you that we had some friends who started a school when our kids were younger, and I'll find the name so you can put it in the show notes.
Great.
But it was a great school for our kids at a certain age, and it was a micro school. Someone who just said, "Hey, I really want to do this." I have some friends. I live in Asheville, North Carolina. I have some friends here who've started a micro school, and I'll get the name of that as well. And I'm just so impressed with them because there's music, and they really work hard to have the kids have a good learning experience. And I think that a lot of homeschool co-ops, for me, fit into a category of something slightly below a micro school in terms of organizational structure, but in fact are probably would meet some of the criteria for micro school, and have really liked some of the ones that I've seen or that our kids were involved in.
Yeah, I've heard some people say that really what microschools are doing is they're making the homeschooling experience accessible to a whole host of people who wouldn't choose it. So the parents with 2 working parents who have, high profile, busy jobs, or, have certain passions that they want to put their full focus on versus one of the parents being responsible for their child's learning. And that it provides this solution that expands that homeschool experience to everybody. I apologize for putting you on the spot. It was funny because I had a different question for you, but as you were talking, I thought, oh my goodness, Steve has to know some really great schools that we should be interviewing. So anybody who's coming up in the future, I think that's going to be a question I'm going to ask everybody. When we talk with school owners, it would be great for them to be able to tell us, our school does this, this, and this, but there are also these other really great schools that do these other things. Because what I know is, like, if you don't like Chinese and you don't like Thai, it doesn't matter that the best Thai restaurants in your neighborhood, right, Steve?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
If your thing is pizza, then I want to know where the best pizza joint is. So, Steve, thank you for joining us today. And for all of you, thanks for joining us for the inaugural edition, the sort of kickoff of the Microschools show. We've got a couple great schools lined up to be featured in our upcoming shows, but we are looking for more schools. So if you would like to be a guest on the show, to talk with me about your microschool, or if you want to talk about your work in the microschools movement, whatever shape and form it takes, please reach out to me at mara@microschoolbuilders.com, and we'll see you next time.